So what you just heard was a tone made completely in Logic Pro. Now obviously if you have the proper gear, it's better to mic an amp, but to be honest, I think this is a very usable tone if you don't have a way to mic your amp, or you don't have very good gear, or you just want a quick plug-in and go tone that you can use to record demos or riff ideas. I actually made this tone a while back, and I've learned more about mixing since then, so this tone could possibly sound even better. So just think of this as a stepping stone, and then you can adjust to your liking. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go over all the plugins I'm using, just in case some of you guys are in a hurry, and then I'll go back over everything in more detail and explain what exactly everything's doing. And then I may briefly talk about fitting it into the mix. Okay, plugins are as follows: Noise Gate, Pedal Board, Amp Designer, Channel EQ, Exciter, another EQ that I probably wouldn't use now because I would do a better job with the first one, and a multipressor. I'm also sending this track to a bus with a room reverb, along with all the other tracks. The main plugins for the tone are the Pedal Board and the Amp Designer. Everything else is just to clean up, tighten up, and help it fit in the mix. I've seen some people use EQ to shape their tone, but I don't really like to do that too much. I try to get the tone sounding as best as possible on its own, and then just use EQ to help it fit in the mix. So for the pedal board, I'm using the wah pedal, Q set to 22, mode set to retro wah, and then the pedal is pushed in so that the first two lights are lit. I'm then using the double dragon pedal, drive set to 15, tone set to 55, level set to 0.1, input set to 0, squash 40, contour 25, mix 100%, and then flip the switch to bright. And then finally a high drive pedal, level set to 0, flip the switch to full. For the amp designer, I'm using a modern British head over a vintage British 4x12 cabinet. The gain can be anywhere from 9 to 10, bass around 4, mids a little past 6, treble around 8.5, reverb off, effects off, presence somewhere around 8, master a little past 8, and then very important, I'm using the ribbon mic, and its position is all the way in the inner left corner, right up on the amp. Now I recorded this using a Schecter Hellraiser with stock pickups, so keep in mind that you may get different results with your guitar, so adjust accordingly. So let me explain what everything's actually doing. The first thing I did was bring a reference track into my project. This is very important because I've tried making metal tones before, but it usually comes out sounding dull and muffled, or scratchy and thin. I just searched online and actually found a solo guitar track for the song My Curse by Killswitch Engage. I think it might have been from Rock Band or something, but it's great because I could listen to the tone and then adjust my tone to match as closely as possible. Now it's not likely that you're going to get a perfect match, but the idea is to copy the properties of the tone. So in this case I was looking for brightness and clarity that didn't sound scratchy and still retained some thickness. So let's start with the amp designer. So the cool thing about this plugin is that you can mix and match the heads with different cabinets. Now at first that might seem kind of overwhelming, but just remember for metal we want a really big in-your-face tone, so we're going to need a big amp. So you can just cancel out all these small amps and just use the 4x12s and maybe some of the 4x10s. So it's really up to your preference. Some of these amps have really high distortion, so you might want to pull back on them, and then some of the clean amps you might want to crank it. I went with the modern British head and the vintage British 4x12 cabinet because that combo seemed to be the least digital, if that makes sense. It had the most kind of warm and clean distortion. It wasn't too fizzy or digital sounding. So when you're adjusting the tone, you can set the gain to wherever sounds pretty good at first, and the main thing you're going to want to do is adjust this EQ. For the bass, I'll usually just palm mute on my guitar and turn it up just to that point where it starts to sound a little muffled. For treble, I like to just play chords, like a standard G major chord. You play the chord, and as you turn the tone up, you'll hear the guitar really open up. And once you get to that point where the change isn't so drastic, that's usually a good place to pull back just a little bit and keep it there. For the mids, we're looking for some bite from our strings. So you're trying to find that sweet spot where the strings just have a lot of attack. You don't want them to be too smooth and blend in together. You really want separation. Again, we want kind of in your face, so you're going to want your presence cranked up pretty good. And then mic placement is very important. Now most likely in real life we would use a dynamic mic, but on these simulators I find that they're a bit harsh. You could try using that and pulling back, but we're losing some of that in-your-faceness. The condenser mic's just a bit too muffled, So the ribbon's sort of a nice sweet spot in between those two. And then you just put it right up on the amp. For pedals, make sure you have the wah pedal. You can mess around with any of the other pedals if you'd like, but you're going to need this wah pedal. It really tightens things up, and this is what's going to give your metal tone that clanky, chunky metal sound. Without it, it's just going to sound kind of crunchy. I'm using the double dragon pedal as my main source of distortion, and then I'm using the high drive just to kind of tighten things up. I got this idea from real life because I've heard a lot of people use a pedal like the Maxon OD808, not to add distortion, but just to tighten up the low end and keep it from sounding too mushy. If you feel like experimenting, there's a little section here in the pedal designer where you can actually select what kind of pedals you want to look for. So you can just select distortion. Some of these are pretty cool, and some of them aren't worth your time. For your main distortion, you could try the Double Dragon or the Monster Fuzz pedal, and even this smiley face one I think was pretty good. For an extra pedal to tighten things up, you could try the Vintage pedal here or this Candy Fuzz one. And you can mix and match all these different things. Everything else isn't really that great. A lot of it's just going to be going back and forth, tweaking the settings on your pedals and on your amp, and then listening to your reference for specific details, and then trying to recreate that with the two plugins. So once you've got your tone sounding as best as possible, you can use an EQ to clean it up a little bit. A few moves I recommend. I definitely recommend using a low cut. I'll usually cut anywhere from 80 to 100 hertz. This just gets rid of a lot of that unnecessary low end and makes more room for the bass. Also, for a little more clarity, there's usually a lot of mud in this 400 hertz area. You're gonna have to listen specifically, but I'll usually cut a little bit of that out. And then if you want to get rid of some of the fizz, you can use a high cut. Now you have to be careful with this area because it does do a good job cleaning up the fizz, but if you go too far, you can start making your guitar tone sound dull again. One thing you can do to counteract that is by boosting the high mids, or by cutting out the high mids from other instruments that might be stealing from the guitar. For compression, I recommend using the multipressor if you know how. It's really good for tightening up that low end, especially for palm mutes. It makes everything sound really punchy and less flabby. And that's it. Record a couple guitar tracks, pan them hard left and right, add some bass and drums, and you're good to go. I hope this was helpful. If anyone has any tips to make this tone sound even better, please share them in the comment section below. I've got more videos on the way, so if you're interested in seeing more music-related content, consider hitting that subscribe button. Until next time.